a big thank you to the organizers of this conference. And so there's Roberta. So I think we should all clap and stand up. And yeah. And there are others, so just there's more applause to come. So there's Sandra. Is there after? There's Monica. There's Anna. And Annie. And Annie. Annie. And there are the student organizers who I don't know by name, and so a big thank you to all of you, wherever you are. And Ina for the debate yesterday. Yes. And here, our sound engineer. Okay, so now I should start. So this is a more general presentation. I tried to be faithful to the general topic of this conference. Those who were in the mini course, there will be some repetition. Okay, so modality, as you know, involves quantification or other types of manipulation with possibilities. The best known cases are these modal auxiliary. It's probably a mere accident that modality is usually discussed in connection with those auxiliaries. Modality occurs just about anywhere. I will be talking a little later about modal adjectives like fragile. Involves modalization. Something that is fragile we may think is something that cannot break easily. And then this last sentence I pulled from the internet this morning. I cannot read it. What this illustrates is a modal qualifier, qualquier, qualquiera, qualsiasi, quiconque. So this whole class of modal modifiers. So they are random choice qualifiers, random choice qualifiers. There's also a whole class of epistemic qualifiers. English some, arguably, is one of those. German manche, Spanish algunos. I will not talk about those, but I will make some recommendations. So there are two recent books that deal with those modal qualifiers. So one is Modality Across Syntactic Categories. So the title gives it away. It's an edited volume by Ana Oregi, Maria Luisa Rivero, and Andres Salanova. And then there's Epistemic Indefinites, and it also has the subtitle Exploring Modality Beyond the Verbal Domain. So that is a big topic right now, and I just want to recommend those two books. So the general questions I'd like to address is, what are the contributions of grammar to the meanings of modal statements? So what is it that grammar contributes to this meaning, and what are non-grammatical contributions to the meanings of modal statements? So I will talk a little bit about non-grammatical contributions, and part of that work was done in collaboration with Jonathan Phillips, who is in the moral psychology department at Harvard University, so a department that deals with social cognition and things like that. Okay. Okay, so those who were in the mini course, you can just go to sleep right now. So here we had that already. So the buzzwords are modal anchors and domain projection functions. If we look at just modal auxiliaries, the usual ones, there's a distinction between lexical distinctions that some languages at least make between modal force, so they're qualifiers, and if they're qualifiers, they can be universal qualifiers, they can be existential qualifiers. Maybe they're not qualifiers at all, they could be plural definite descriptions of worlds. So all of that falls under modal force. What interests us here most is the modal domain. So auxiliaries, modal auxiliaries, they usually don't give us a lot of indication of what the modal domain is, what the domain of quantification is. And so that is something to think about how do we construct modal domains. Usually what we know about modal domains is that they're sensitive to what the facts are in a world, so they are factive constraints on modal domains, but they're also sensitive to normative restrictions like what is good, what is useful, what is legal, etc. Okay, so there has been a very important contribution, a sort of almost paradigm-changing contribution by Valentine Accard in her dissertation. And what she managed to do is to derive the different flavors of modality. So when we talk about flavors of modality, we talk about maybe root modality, something like can. These are modals that are sitting low in the syntactic tree. Or we may be talking about epistemic modals. These are modals that are sitting high in the syntactic tree. And what Accard did is she made a beautiful proposal about how to project modal domains from syntactically provided anchors. So these are objects that are syntactically provided at different stages in the syntactic derivation. And so the idea is if a modal anchor is sitting low in the tree, then you get something like root modality. If a modal anchor is sitting high in the tree, you get something like epistemic modality, all with the very same projection mechanism. And so that's the beauty of the system, that say if you have a multifunctional modal like must, if you merge it low in the tree, it will be something like a root modal. If you merge it high in the tree, it will be something like an epistemic modal. And so what I'm going to do here will follow this program, but will differ in details. So I will make a different proposal about what the anchors are, where the anchors come from, and also a slightly different proposal about what the domain projection function is. But the general program is the Accard type constructivist program, where the modal that you see, or the modal meaning that you see in the end, is constructed from these two pieces, where one piece comes from the construction itself, from the site, from the syntactic position where that modal is, and the other piece is whatever the modal brings itself to the table. Okay, so that's sort of the general. So here, this is a blueprint for a modal auxiliary. So this is the kind of modal that you could merge in different positions in a syntactic tree. It is very unexciting. It has doesn't have a lot of special, interesting, complicated pieces. It's really the bare bones of a modal. So we have here the argument structure. You can read it off. of the variables that follow the lambdas. And so a modal operator, it takes a propositional argument. So that could be a set of situations, could be a set of possible worlds, a set of events. Then the next argument is the evaluation situation. So that's the evaluation situation. And so that is a promising object for a modal anchor. Then we introduce, because we have a universal modal here, we introduce universal quantification over worlds. And the worlds that we are quantifying over are projected from the anchor situation via a mechanism that I will talk about. So here there's a free variable in the logical conceptual representation here that we have to fill in particular ways. And the idea is that the syntax doesn't tell us anything about how that is filled. The conceptual system provides a few possibilities that in the best of all possible worlds are all freely available. Okay, so that's the projection function. So that gives us the modal domain. And what we're saying here is that P is also called the prejacent in technical jargon. And so I'll use that jargon from time to time because it's convenient. So what the formula in the end says is that prejacent has to be true in all the worlds in the modal domain. So that is the blueprint for modal auxiliary. And so if a Cart's program, if it works out, then we plug this in low, and we get a root modal. We plug it in at other positions, maybe in rather high in the tree, we get an epistemic modal. Maybe if we plug it in even higher, we get something more speech-acty related. Okay, so that's the general program. So here's just a picture of the verbal projection spine, no labels, so they're just regions here. So in the lowest regions, we build argument structure. Then, so argument structure, building the output of that. These are all properties of events that have particular properties. Then we enter the spectral temporal region where we map properties of events into properties of times or properties of situations. So we locate the events with respect to a situation that we are looking at, a viewing situation, a topic situations. Going higher up, we may have evidence situations that we introduce with evidentials, for example. Going even higher up, because Roberta, you wanted me to go higher up at some point, we may have a speech act projection and may have yet, there are these very, very high unembeddable epistemic modals. German Dürfte is probably one of those. So to test for height in a modal embedded in an if clause, that's always a good test. For example, English might is embeddable in an if clause, so it can't be so high, but German Dürfte is no longer embeddable in an if clause. So that's then very high. So that's sort of the general picture. And here I just gave you a few formulas so that you have a more vivid image about what it may mean that different types of anchors are made available at various places in the verbal projection spine. So here, the first one is just the logical conceptual representation for a verb like fall. So a verb like fall is an unaccusative verb, so it has an individual argument, that's the X, and then it has an event argument, that is an E. And so both X and E are possible anchors. So when we submerge a verb like that, these two anchors are available. And so if we have another operation that wants to project a modal domain from one or the other, so that would be possible at this stage. As we proceed with the derivation, those arguments are no longer available. The event argument is possibly existentially quantified. Something happens, the individual argument may be saturated with a proper name. So these arguments are only available low in the structure, and as we proceed, they're no longer available. Then here, these are just sort of arbitrary examples of what the denotations of higher functional heads may look like. So what you see under aspect, that could be something like a perfective aspect. So the p variable is meant to range over properties of events, so it operates over properties of events. So that's the output of the argument structure building. Then we get an evaluation situation that we always have. We quantify off the event argument, so that means we're done with the event argument. No other computation can see it any longer, so it's gone. Then there is a requirement that the events that we are talking about have the property of the project, the property determined by the constituent that the spectral operator operates over. And then there's a requirement, the perfective requirement, that the event be included in the situation that we're looking at. So that's just an example, so nothing serious. Then there could be something like a temporal operator. And so you see a temporal operator operates over a proposition, a set of possible situations. The result is another proposition, and there's certain requirements on the evaluation situation that it be passed with respect to the utterance time, something like that, just to give you an idea. From then on, it's pretty much propositions all the way up. So it's all these other operators, they're very likely to be propositional operators. They map propositions into propositions. Okay, so that's just to give you an idea what it may mean that different possible anchors are made available in different stages of a syntactic derivation. Okay, so the most basic and also the most frequent type of modal domain projection is what I like to call factual domain projection. And the way it works is that you have a limited part of reality, like the situation that we find ourselves in, and you're looking at the set of all possible worlds that have an exact match of that situation. So the cognitive operation is you're trying to imagine what the world may be like outside the situation that you are immediately connected to. So that is sort of the general idea. So factual domain projection, a piece of reality, and so that could be an individual, that could be an event, that could be a situation. Anything that's part of the actual world could function as a potential anchor. So in that sense, a proposition cannot be a possible anchor because a proposition is not part of the actual world, and a property cannot be a possible anchor because a property is not part of the actual world. But anything that's a particular can be a modal anchor. Okay, so we had this example already, so a Yeti must have walked by. So what we're saying here, so we have these tracks in the snow. We're looking at possible worlds that have an exact match of that partial situation. And if it's true that in all of them a Yeti walked by, then the statement is true. If we're really looking at the set of all possible worlds, then the statement doesn't have a very good chance to be true, because we would then basically be talking about logical possibilities. And so we have implicit restrictions here. You know, the world has to function in pretty much the way it actually does function. So we have laws of nature. And as we'll see, these normalcy assumptions are generally defeasible. So if you're uncooperative, if you mean you just keep going, but raise one possibility after the other and defeat the statement. And this is actually something interesting about modal statement. They're generally defeasible. So in a way, they're made to collapse. So it really depends on the cooperation of the people you are talking to. Okay, so that's a quick summary so far. So modal domains are projecting from anchors, individual event situations. that are routinely provided in the course of a syntactic derivation. So they're provided by lexical items or functional heads. And so what I'd like to show you next is that this factual domain projection may be a little disappointing. It's kind of boring. It's such a simple mechanism. Can it do much? And so, but it actually can do quite a lot of rather interesting work. And I'll give you one example. I'll call it the puzzle of strength. And so there is the linguist Lauri Karttunen, who in the 70s claimed that a statement like there is a dripping faucet is in fact a stronger statement than a statement like there must be a dripping faucet. Okay. So the situation that you should imagine for this is, I'm telling you, I just discovered with my own eyes a dripping faucet in the kitchen. Or maybe even better, we are all together in the kitchen, and here is a dripping faucet right in front of us. And so I say, oh, look, there is a dripping faucet. So that seems to be okay. If I say, look, there must be a dripping faucet, that is very strange indeed. And so for that reason, Karttunen proposed that P is actually stronger than must P. And I, in my early work, took up this suggestion and designed a must that makes, in such a way that P would come out as stronger than must P. And so that means that you impose constraints on the modal domain for must that possibly eliminates the actual world from the domain. So there's like normalcy constraints, ways the world, normal ways the world may work. Okay, so this is the argument in this situation that we are imagining the must statement is not appropriate. So we are looking at the dripping faucet. So you have to imagine that situation. In that situation, one is not appropriate. And so Karttunen, the way he explained this is that, one has a must has a semantic that has the effect that one comes out weaker than two, and then we can make a Gricean argument. Since I was in a position to make the stronger statement, there's a dripping faucet, I shouldn't have uttered the weaker one, and so this is why one in that particular situation is deviant. Okay, so here is factual domain projection. Here's what is happening is we're all focusing on that dripping faucet. So that was part of my story. We're all looking at the faucet. And so when I say something like there must be a dripping faucet, what we're doing is we're taking that situation with the dripping faucet as our anchor. And so if we take that as our anchor, that dripping faucet will appear in all worlds in our domain. So these are all worlds that have a dripping faucet. So it's trivially true in a way that on that picture, it's trivially true that if there is a dripping faucet, there must be a dripping faucet. Okay, so that is the picture. Okay, so now let's look at the logical forms, and so that will be important. So these are logical conceptual forms that give us the meaning. And so here is a formalization for there must be a dripping faucet. So we have this situation S0, that's the situation we're looking at with the dripping faucet. It's part of the actual world that's just formalized here. And now we're looking at all the worlds that are projected from this anchor. Factual domain projection is what we're using. So we get the set of all worlds that have a match. And we have to assume that's a good match, a really, really tight match of the dripping faucet situation. And then what we're saying is in all worlds in the modal domain, there is a situation that is part of the respective world, and that situation has a dripping faucet in it. So there is a dripping faucet here is formulated, and you'll see that will be important later on. I formalized it as a statement about a particular situation. So I sort of really tried to make you focus on that particular situation. So what we're saying is there's this, we're not saying there is, we are referring to this S0, and that's important. We're not saying there is, we're just saying there is. No, you know what I want to say. I'm no longer saying it. It's written here. But what is meant? We are talking about a particular situation. We are not making an existential statement. We're just talking about this particular situation, and we are predicating dripping faucetness of that situation. Okay. And so here, I mean, you can sort of show that 2 asymmetrically entails 1. And assuming, as we have, that all accessible worlds in the domain have a really good match of S0. So the match has to be really good, so we preserve the dripping faucet. Okay. So everybody sort of sees that? Okay, because now I will prove the opposite, namely that. So that's going to happen. Okay, so here's the puzzle of strength, and so here's von Fintel and Gillis. And so here you have the opposite claim. There's a dripping faucet, and there must be a dripping faucet. And they're really, I mean, if you read the article, it's kind of mean. They're really making fun of this earlier view that, of course, I adopted in my younger years. And so they call it the mantra, and then they go one whole article going against that mantra. So the claim here is there must be a dripping faucet is stronger than there is a dropping faucet. And what that claim amounts to is that the modal domain for this epistemic must can never be restricted in such a way that the actual world is knocked out of the domain. So the actual world always has to be in the domain, and so must P does logically imply P. So they argue for that. Let's see what the arguments are, but let's go slowly. So I give you a slightly, actually that's not their argument, so that's my reconstruction of where they're coming from. And so here we have, I don't know, I don't know anything about water meters and stuff like that. So, but I learned in constructing this example a little bit about plumbing. So I inspected the water meter and saw that water consumption has gone up dramatically. Okay, so I just see, look at the water meter and say, oh my God, I used a lot of water. And I say there must be a dripping faucet. So same statement again, I say there must be a dripping faucet. And so we investigate the situation and find that there are no dripping faucets, but there's a leaking toilet tank. Okay, so in this case, we would say that statement is wrong. Okay, so that I said something false. And that is basically the von Fintel and Gillis intuition. The way this is reconstructed under factual domain projection, so I did transport you in a situation where our topic situation, our evidence situation, is not the dripping faucet, but it is the water meter. Okay, so we are our anchor is a situation that has the water meter, and but we're constructing our modal domain. So that's the set of all possible worlds that have a good match of the water meter. And so the claim is that in all of those worlds, there's a dripping faucet, and that's pretty obviously false. So I mean, even if we are assuming, and we're assuming that the water meter is working okay, that there's nothing wrong, but then of course, I mean, there could be anything in the house that could be causing this water consumption, and indeed, it was the toilet tank that was leaking. Okay, so we can account for this intuition as well. And so now we look at the logical formulas, and you see, lo and behold, now they are reversed. So now 1 is stronger than 2. So 1 is formalized just as we did before. But here now, crucially, 2 is formalized with an existential statement. So here, there is a dripping faucet is now formalized as an existential statement. There is a situation, an actual situation. It's part of the actual world, and that is a dripping faucet in situation. If you look at 1, the implication follows if you assume, as you should, that everything is a match of itself. I mean, our matching relation should be construed in a way that everything is a match of itself, and so that means this actual water meter situation is a match of itself. And so that means that the actual world is in the modal domain. And so that means if the prejacent is true in all worlds in the modal domain, it has to be true in the actual world. Okay. So in a way, I have fooled you into accepting both Karttunen's position and the von Fintel and Gillies position. And the diagnosis that I want to offer for the case is it's so factual domain projection in a way allows us to do justice to both opinions. And there's a very, very slight ambiguity in the formalization in our understanding of a sentence like there is a dripping faucet. This is the kind of ambiguity that we also know from the semantics of tense, whether the tense is referential or whether the tense is existentially qualified. So this is the same kind of ambiguity. So in this case, there is a dripping faucet. There was just a claim, well, there is such a situation, and we are not making a claim about a particular situation. And so the Karttunen scenario arises whenever we have a prejacent that is true in the anchor situation. And sort of interestingly, we can now derive the indirectness requirement for must from that kind of semantics. So one way of phrasing that indirectness requirement is like for must statement not to come out trivially, for an epistemic must statement not to come out trivially, the prejacent cannot be true in the anchor situation. So there's in some sense, we don't have to make any stipulation about that this is an evidential or something like that. I mean, it's really sort of the other way around. Maybe we can explain certain evidential requirements in those terms. Okay, so that's just a demonstration of the kind of power of factual domain projection. Okay, so we had here, there's a subtle ambiguity. I gave you 2 formalization of the simple statement, there's a dripping faucet, with a well-known ambiguity. Okay, so here's just following up on von Fintel and Gillies' intuition that must is really strong. I mean, that's sort of the kind of argument they actually give. So I say there must be a dripping faucet, and you say, no, you're wrong. The faucets are fine. There's a leaking toilet tank. And then I reply, I didn't say there was a dripping faucet. I only said there must be a dripping faucet. And that does not sound very convincing. And compare that to a weak modal where there might be a dripping faucet. No, you're wrong. The faucets are fine. There's a leaking toilet tank. I didn't say that there was a dripping faucet. I only said that there might be a dripping faucet, and that is right. Also, you can make the modal even stronger. There should be a dripping faucet that still goes through, but it doesn't go through with must, and so that shows that must is strong. So I've shown that must is strong and must is weak. So that's basically what I've shown. And if you think it's contradictory, so that's, yeah. Okay, so the upshot is like both Karttunen and von Fintel and Gillies are right. factual domain projection explains how that can be. Modal statements, they're under-informative if the prejacent is true in the anchor situation. So we don't want the prejacent to be true in the anchor situation. Okay, so now where do these modal anchors come from? And so I'd like to just present a couple of case studies. One I sort of briefly mentioned already in the mini course. Let's compare one A and B. So we have this is a glass that is fragile. Compare that to this is a glass that can break easily. Two sentences, they seem to be very close in meaning, but we'll see in a minute that they actually don't mean exactly the same. And in order to see this, here's a story that is due to David Lewis in a different context. So here's a sorcerer takes a liking to a fragile glass, one that is a perfect intrinsic duplicate of all the other fragile glasses of the same production line. He does nothing at all to change the dispositional character of his glass. He only watches and waits, resolved that if ever his glass is struck, then quick as a flash, he will cast a spell that changes the glass, renders it no longer fragile, and thereby aborts the process of breaking. So that's the background story. And so now we look at the same sentence again. So against the background of that story, this is a glass that is fragile, is still true. The sorcerer doesn't change things here. But this is a glass that can break easily. At least there's an understanding of that sentence where it is false on the scenario because it can't break easily because it has protection. The sorcerer protects it so it can no longer break easily. So in the glass is fragile, the modal anchor would be the glass. So that's the argument of the adjective. And so we're looking, our modal domain is the set of all worlds that have matches of that class with all the properties, whatever it is like. And in all of those worlds, suitable restrictions, implicit restrictions, there is at least one world where that glass breaks. Yeah. This glass can break easily, so that has, oh yeah, so we, actually we have that already. Let me see, did I? Oh yeah, no, I have to talk about this. We didn't have that. So this glass can break easily. With can, what seems to happen is that as a modal anchor, we are not just taking the glass all by itself, but we are taking, as part of our anchor, some of the relevant circumstances that that glass finds itself in. And so that particular glass is protected by a sorcerer. And so there is an understanding where in all worlds in our domain, if we use factual domain projection, in all worlds in our domain, that glass is protected by the sorcerer, and so it cannot break easily. Okay, so what we've just seen is that a modal auxiliary like can and modal adjectives, that they can take different anchors. So the adjective necessarily takes the external argument of the adjective as its anchor, whereas with the modal auxiliary, at least there's a possibility of construing the anchor in such a way that it does not just contain the glass, but also the relevant circumstances. So it takes a situation as an anchor. So I'd like to just propose something like the modal anchor conjecture, so that the anchor of a modal expression is one of its arguments. So that would be the proposal. How do we find the modal anchors? It's always an argument of the modal, and so we have to reflect a little bit about what that would mean, or how the right result would come about in the case of the modal auxiliary can. And I sort of see time is progressing faster than I thought, so I'll skip a little bit, but There's a whole literature, and you so find it in the slides, which, by the way, are here, arguing that modals like can, that they are raising predicates. And so if they're raising predicates, you can sort of get an idea of what the arguments leading to this claim are by comparing by thinking about the two readings that a sentence like to has. So if we have a lot of people can jump in this pool, that sentence has two readings. One reading is a lot of people have the ability, the capacity to jump in this pool. And the other reading is really this pool has the capacity to accommodate a lot of people. We're sort of interested in 2' here, where the can really takes scope over a lot of people. A lot of people jump in this pool. Now, if can is a raising predicate, then the two arguments it has a propositional argument and it has a situation argument. That's the evaluation situation. So the proposition is not a possible anchor. So the situation is the only possible anchor. And so that's, I propose, accounts for the difference that we saw between fragile and can break easily. With fragile, obligatorily, the glass is the anchor. But with can, we have several possibilities. And one possibility is that we take as our anchor the glass plus the circumstances that include the sorcerer. So I'll do this a little faster. And so here, if modals are raising predicates, they have a propositional argument, a situation argument. Modal anchors are parts of the evaluation world. And then the anchor for a raising modal has to be its situation argument. So we can only take the situation argument then. And of course, situations, then that's the further point. Events and situations are very poorly individuated. So the criteria for individuation of what's one event, what's two event, what's one situation, what's two situations, they're very vague. And so the judgment about the sorcerer and the glass are not so clear because you can shift the anchor situation, make it smaller or bigger. And so that's, so here is like you say, this glass can't break, it is protected. And then I reply, what if the sorcerer dropped dead? Okay, so the modal domain can always be widened by shrinking the anchor, by leaving out more and more of the outside circumstances, or you can narrowing the domain by widening the anchor, making the anchor bigger. Okay, so that's okay. So I think we will be okay. So we saw a certain amount of indeterminacy coming in by having anchors that are poorly individuated, like situations and events. Unlike, I mean, they're just more poorly individuated than individuals are. And now I'd like to draw attention to another source of vagueness in modal claims. And so that's vagueness that, or indeterminacy that comes in through the unspoken, the implicit modal restrictions. And so here are sort of three facts about modal domains. So the assignment of truth conditions to modal statements really requires fully specified modal domains. So if they're not fully specified, you don't get explicit truth conditions. But the truth is, modal domains are never fully specified. Okay, and so the interesting fact is that there isn't really any pressure for speakers to fully specify the modal domain. So if you use a pronoun, if I just look to the ceiling and said he ate too much again, and look at the ceiling, what I'm saying is highly unacceptable. I mean, if I'm using a referential pronoun without specifying a reference, this is highly deviant. So in this case, so this is why modal domain variables, I mean, if there is such a thing at all, I mean, they do not behave like pronouns because there's no pressure whatsoever to be explicit about specifying the modal domain. So it's just an interesting fact about modal domain. So there's no pressure whatsoever. I'll leave that out. Okay, so here is an example illustrating this point, again by David Lewis, who saw all of those issues very clearly. So what he says is like, suppose I'm talking, this is a Cold War example, so way before most of you were born. So suppose, I mean, if you even know what the Cold War was, so it was all about communists and things like that. So suppose I'm talking with some elected official about the ways he might deal with an embarrassment. So far, we have been ignoring those possibilities that would be political suicide for him. He says, you see, I must either destroy the evidence or else claim that I did it to stop communism. What else can I do? I rudely reply, there's one other possibility. You can put the public interest first for once. So you can always do that. So somebody has sort of an area modal domain excluding possibilities here. You know, what else can I do? Don't want to commit political suicide, and then boof. I mean, you can widen the domain, bring in more possibilities, and that person you're talking to just has to give in, has to fold. I mean, there's something very, very powerful about doing this. It's interesting that people don't do it more or all the time. Okay, so this is just... so the fact that speakers can't easily object when hearers push the boundaries of modal domains to prove them wrong just suggests that there isn't any particular commitment to a particular modal domain to begin with. Okay, so the question is, where does the instability of modal domains come from? And here we are entering the discussion of these implicit modal domains. So one conclusion I draw from this, like in contrast, say, to my earlier work on modals, is that these implicit restriction on modal domains, I mean, they're not linguistically represented. They come from wherever they come from, but they're not linguistically represented. One source for the indeterminacy, as we have seen, is the poor individuation of modal anchors, possibly, of their situations. But then there are these diffeasible normalcy assumptions on the range of possibilities that we consider. And these restrictions are not specifically tied to modal words. I mean, we have them all the time. So this is an example I've used before quite often, so some of you may know it. But it's an interesting example that teaches us something about default assumptions. And the example is taken from a best-selling book by Kahneman about thinking fast and slow. And so the idea here is that we have sort of two systems of thinking, of reasoning. One is fast but very unreliable, so we come up with wrong conclusions all the time. And the other one is slow but very reliable. And so he has this example, so it's like you get this in an intelligence test or something like that if you're unlucky enough to have to take that test. So if it takes 5 machines 5 minutes to make 5 widgets, how long would it take 100 machines to make 100 widgets? And apparently, I mean, according to Kahneman, as he says in the footnote, the 5-minute answer is the correct one, and the 100-minute answer is the one that is suggested by our unreliable, too fast thinking system. And so, once you sort of look a little closer at this example, you sort of see that it's Kahneman that is the victim to the fast system here, because either answer requires some additional assumptions that are just not in the sentence all by itself. And so here you have, like, what you have to assume to come up with the 5-minute answer is that you have these machines, you have the 100 machines, they're all they're all built in the very same way. They all work in the very same way. And the most special assumption is that they have to work simultaneously. So they have to sort of start at the same time, and they have to end at the same time. And so these are normalcy assumptions that are not given in those sentences themselves. And so this would be the scenario if you come up with 100-minute answers. So you could have machines that work one after the other. So when one stops, the other one starts. And so I usually use this example just to show that we constantly bring in these normalcy assumptions with statements that have no modal at all. So the statement that we looked at had no modal at all. These normalcy assumptions influence interpretations regardless of modals. And so that is really a very good reason of not packing them at all into the semantics of modals. Okay, so the interesting observation here, the conclusion is that the grammar really determines a very broad range of possibilities, and then these normalcy constraints kick in, and so we then end up with considering a much narrower range of possibilities. Okay, so, and grammar always wins in a way. Once I sort of give you these scenarios, I think, suppose you fail your intelligence test because you give the answer 100, then you could go to the board that administers the test and say, here, look, here you have these scenarios, and I think they would have to pass you. Yeah, because you'd say, this is not in the sentence. There are various scenarios, and so this is why it's good to study semantics, to make that kind of argument. So grammar wins in the end. So these narrow interpretations can always be challenged. So if you let these normalcy assumptions fool you, you can always challenge them. And so the broad interpretations can always be pushed for. And this can only end badly, of course, because you push up to logical possibility, which becomes useless in the end. Okay. So now I'm coming to the end, so that is good. So here, with Jonathan Phillips, we have for quite a while we have been sort of exploring the impact of these normalcy conditions. So Jonathan, as I said, he's actually a psychologist and philosopher and linguist, but he's in the moral psychology lab. He's a postdoc there at Harvard. And what has interested him is how these domains of possibilities are constructed for various types of statements, for causal statements. So he's investigated causal reasoning, but also modal reasoning. And what he has found and what interests him is that as a default, people construct these domains of possibilities in a way that they don't really separate factual conditions from normative conditions. Like they don't, when you construct a domain of possibilities, you don't really include possibilities, say, where somebody acts really badly, for example. So that makes a difference. So that's a particular interest of him. And so what we're doing together is sort of building this bridge between grammar and non-linguistic, non-language-related cognition. And so the hunch here is that general cognition contributes the domain projection function, or the repertoire of domain projection function, how people in general project possibilities from reality. So that would be something like part of human core knowledge. And then also non-linguistic cognition contributes these diffusible normalcy constraints. And so here, so that is the end of this talk here. So we investigated could versus might, and so here's a story, cruel story. Fitzroy is a notoriously ruthless pirate who decided to pose as a captain of a ship in order to steal several expensive sculptures that a museum needs to transport across the sea. After he posed as an ordinary ship captain who was taking some passengers across the sea, Fitzroy got the job. While sailing on the sea, a large storm came upon Fitzroy and his small ship. As the waves began to grow larger, Fitzroy realized that his small vessel was too heavy and the ship would flood if he didn't make it lighter. The only things on Fitzroy's small boat were the expensive art sculptures that he was stealing and several passengers. He knew he had to throw something overboard to keep the ship from capsizing. So now you know how it ends. So the question is, Fitzroy should throw the passengers overboard. Fitzroy could throw the passengers overboard, and Fitzroy might throw the passengers overboard. Okay, so then you sort of ask people whether they agree or disagree, should, could, or might. And so here's slightly disappointing result, should. I mean, most at least think it should be the sculptures, but that's what you get. So here, this is might. And so remember, I mean, the figure Fitzroy is an evil person, so he might do bad things. That's just the way the facts are, is that he might do. And then there's a very significant difference now between could and might. So that suggests that with could, these moral considerations play a role. So there's a difference, like with might really is only interested in facts. And so might very actively resists this, what we call moral intrusion in the domain of possibilities, whereas could very easily tolerates moral considerations to creep in. It's sort of interesting, and Jonathan has another paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where he so he mapped out a little bit the time course, like he made people do speeded judgments on tests like this, as opposed to reflected judgments. And when people do speeded judgments, they sort of hardly differentiate between could and might. And so it seems like when people do speeded judgments, then there's this kind of mush of factual and moral restrictions that is still undifferentiated. When they do more reflected judgments, they very clearly differentiate between might and could, where that means that's the end, right? No, it's a good, that's a good, it is the end, it is the end. So the conclusion from that would be that the modal vocabulary, at least the English modal vocabulary that we looked at, still is sensitive to these normative restrictions, and might very clearly tells you we only look at facts. We don't look at normative restrictions in addition, whereas could is neutral in that respect. Okay, so I think I leave out the rest because it's time to conclude. And so that's the summary. Modal domains are projected as fixed recipes from anchors provided in various positions of syntactic representations. Then implicit domain restrictions are defeasible and not syntactically represented. So they come from other systems of cognition. And then the last one was might and could differ with respect to the implicit domain restrictions they tolerate. So lexical items are sensitive to what they tolerate in what's intruding here in the way we normally construct possibilities. Okay, so that's the end. The end. anybody still has has the energy to ask a question.
We do have time for questions. Okay.
I wrote it down.
Mhm.
So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So the possibility of changing the modal domain that we saw in the Nixon case, I think it was, right?
What was it? But the Cold
Yeah, yeah.
War case, yeah, the Cold War case, yeah.
So it's contingent on relative prestige of the interlocutors, right? So in that case, it was probably suggested by a advisor of whoever it was that we were talking to. I guess I'll just call him Nixon.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's good. I'd never thought about it, but it could be.
But
Yeah.
if it was suggested, say, by an aide, it would have
Yeah.
probably been rejected or
Yeah.
met with laughter, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, could you say any? Does that say anything about it, or?
Well, I think that's something to investigate. I mean, what is the dynamics? I'm not sure. I mean, whether it's really restricted by prestige, because you could put somebody on the spot, and that's, I think, what happened there. I mean, if you have the guts as an underling to speak in this way, I mean, it will not end good, right? I mean, but so in principle. I think from a semantic point of view, it may be useful to sort of separate the power mechanism here from what is semantically possible by just maybe playing the game with two people who are complete equals. And you can, I mean, yeah, you can. I think all of those statements are defeasible up to the point where you reach logical possibility. I mean, but you have to, I mean, in some cases, I mean, you have to challenge to say, oh, I don't believe in the laws of nature, I mean, there are these strange things that happen in the world, like these really unique events, teleporting or whatever. And at that point, you may lose. At that point, you may lose your partner and say, well, let's not talk about those extreme cases. But yeah, in principle, you can apply this challenge. And then, of course, if there's a power differential, you may want to guard your words. It's
Questions? I have one.
mhm.
I was wondering if, for example, when we discuss should in English, and then we contrast with some other models in Portuguese, specifically, for example, to give suggestions or to give orders and so on, right?
Yeah.
So it seems that sometimes, and then I'm going for Janovich's approach about, we have this idea of cost, right? In the sense, so it doesn't cost to do something, not about literal cost, but more metaphorical cost, right? And then, do you think that maybe, for example, with the difference between must and should, in a certain sense, we could have some kind of, in a more dynamic, interactive idea, that the speaker is in a way evoking some moral duty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, maybe I will show you the remaining examples, because they were exactly about this. So far, I mean, I just looked at must here and can, and what I said about these moral considerations coming in through defeasible normalcy constraints. I was really talking about these neutral modals, and I was not talking about ought and should. And so maybe I shouldn't have left this. This is where it is. So once we have something like ought and should, they are lexically specified for invoking certain deontic constraints, like normative constraints. And here's sort of it's a very interesting minimal compare, this is due to Einat Rubinstein, appears in her dissertation, where she has an example like Rachel is a student coming to the United States where it is illegal still not to have health insurance. And so here, compare 1 and 2, Rachel has to get health insurance as opposed to Rachel should get health insurance. And the difference is subtle. If there is this law saying, well, she has to get health insurance, that's the normal thing. If you say she should get health insurance, you're already considering the possibility that she may not go with the law. So it's a different type of necessity. You're already suggesting, well, it still would be a good thing if she got health insurance. And so there you see, I mean, they're very, I mean, should invokes, and that is also interesting, it invokes considerations that are not part of the normalcy assumption. The normalcy assumption is you go by the law. You know, there's health insurance, okay, you have to get it. And the should is already invoking, also bringing into play certain moral constraints or certain normative constraints that are maybe not or not assumed to be collectively accepted. So that is, and I could see that, you know, there are other, like what you mentioned, the models you mentioned that bring in other considerations of this kind. What would fit well with that approach is just like here is that the plain modal, in a way the vanilla modal, goes with the commonly presumed constraints, whereas whatever is lexicalized is something different.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, we are. We're done.
Yeah, you sure?
Everybody is tired.
Everybody's tired, yes.
Yeah. We have to.
So I have a question, but I can make it afterwards.
Oh no, you can ask a question if you have a question.
Yes,
you should not hold back. It's just that everybody's too tired.
I find it a little bit puzzling, but it's maybe because I don't get it, the whole picture yet. But so you were saying that we have to have the anchor, and that where this anchor somehow is checked, it's going to give you the flavor in a sense, because if it's very low in the derivation, you have to have some sort of root interpretation, right? And if it's up in the derivation or high in the derivation, you have epistemic, and maybe if you have even higher, you have speech act, right? So at the same time, okay, so this seems to be the case, but at the same time, it seems that you were saying that those normacy constraints and those deontic constraints, whatever, they are pragmatic in the sense they are not in grammar.
Yeah, they're not in the grammar, and they're not specifically targeting modals either. Yeah.
But at the same time, if the anchor is checked low, you will get, if I understood you correctly, you will get root interpretations. You just don't know whether this is going to be ability, and that's or deontic, and that's for the context. This is pragmatical.
The cases I discussed, they all had factual domain projection. So that is, so they all had factual domain projection. And so if you allow, if you're still building argument structure, then, I mean, if you say, I can climb these mountains, so my inherent properties at the time in question play a role. So the anchor will be me at that particular time, possibly with particular surroundings. And so that is in a way the difference. So we will be looking at possible futures for this temporal slice of myself. And so that is a big difference. Whereas if we higher up, so these are all raising constructions. I mean, these are all propositional operators that we have, they're all raising constructions. So the only possible anchors are situations.
So it's only situation.
Yeah, higher up. But then it depends on, like, if you have an evidential up there, an evidential will switch the situations that you're looking at to evidence situations. So then you look at evidence situations. If you have like a speech act representation, the situations you will be looking at will be the utterance situation. And so you can project from there. Yeah. So that is, in a way, I mean, that's the kind of flavor distinction that you get out of that, out of the height is.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, in principle, you should like have lexically imposed normative constraints at every height. And I think you do that. So you have when we heard that yesterday, the low deontics and the high deontics, for example. So those constraints like should be possible to have them at every stage. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Obrigada.
Okay, so I'm supposed to final remarks and then the end, and then we go home. So I want to call Sandra and Monica, Annie and Anna. Where is Anna? And Ina. Oh, I forgot. I have some announcements. First, the certificates will be sent by email. Just give us a couple of days, please. Also, the receipts as well. And yes, there will be publication. And we are planning at least a book. We have talked to John Benjamin, so maybe it will work. And we also want to organize a special volume of a journal. I will let you know as soon as we can organize that after finishing everything with copies and everything. Okay, so don't worry, you will hear from us soon about certificates, receipts, and also publication, okay? And, okay, so this is the end. I want to thank you, everybody that here, and I want to thank especially Professor Angelika Kratzer and Professor Luigi Rizzi for being here with us. It was a long but very interesting and nice journey. I'm very tired, but I have learned a lot. And I also want to say this is my last time organizing anything. So this is the end. This is the end for me. I'm too much. I have already organized too many events. So yeah, thank you so much for coming. Did I forget? Hey, yes. I want to call to us to chamar. How to say call? To call our students who have helped us, so we can say thank you to them. So Diego, Isabella, and who is here anymore? Gabriel is here, and well, come on, you guys. Agora eu falo que eu comprei presentinho. Você fala. Não. Você fala. Eu falo? Ok. Como é que eu falo isso? Okay. We bought two very little things for Angelika and for Luigi that we would like to offer. I mean, they came to Brazil, to Florianópolis. They worked a lot. So yeah, and okay? Yeah. No, this is not you. Yes, this is you. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for coming. O que mais que eu tenho que falar? Yeah, very tired. He's very tired.
Thank you, Professor, for everything. It was very nice. Thank you.
Thank you for almost killing you.
I'm just fine. I open this at home.
Yeah, take care. Yes, better. Okay, and final word is, we have to take pictures, of course. And Monica is going to Macau, and she wants to hold the next EISSI. So our next meeting in 3 years is going to be in Macau, which is true. It's true, yes. I mean, that's what. Yes, true.
So yes, you're all invited to the next EISSI, the 4th edition. It will be hosted in Macau by two institutions, University of Macau, and the Macau University of Science and Technology. So hopefully, the must. It's a model. Yes, yes. Okay, so thank you and hoping to see you there.